After World War II, 28 Japanese leaders, including Hideki Tojo, generals, and former prime ministers, were put on trial in Tokyo. 7 would eventually be sentenced to hang, but one very obvious person was missing: Emperor Hirohito. He wasn't hiding somewhere or waiting in a prison cell. He was still living in the Imperial Palace, and when the trials were over, he would still be emperor. Which is weird. Hirohito had been emperor during Japan's war in China, during Pearl Harbor, and throughout the Pacific War. So if the Allies were putting Japan's wartime leadership on trial, you would think the emperor might at least get a chair. He didn't. So how does the emperor of a defeated empire somehow miss the trial built to judge the people who led that empire into war? The answer starts with a problem that had almost nothing to do with courtrooms. Japan had surrendered. Great, war over. Except America had just inherited a much uglier question. Who was going to run Japan tomorrow morning? American troops could occupy the country, secure the ports, and guard government buildings. What they could not do was replace the entire Japanese state overnight. Japan still had ministries, police departments, railway offices, local governments, and an enormous bureaucracy spread across the country. Washington had already decided that, wherever possible, the occupation would use that machinery instead of throwing the whole thing away and rebuilding Japan from zero. Think of it like taking over a building. You might change the management, the rules, even half the wiring. But if the elevators still work, you probably don't rip them out just for fun. America wanted the Japanese state to keep functioning while it changed who that state answered to. Reasonable enough. Except the machinery came with one very inconvenient piece attached to it: Hirohito. The emperor had lost the war, but he had not suddenly become irrelevant. The imperial institution still carried enormous symbolic weight, and Japanese officials had spent their careers working inside a political system built around it. Now, the Americans wanted those same officials to carry out surrender orders, demobilize the country, keep basic administration running, and eventually help rebuild the political system. That changed the calculation. Yesterday, Hirohito sat at the top of the enemy state. Today, he might help make that state cooperate. Very useful. And very awkward. Because while the Americans were starting to see Hirohito as a tool of occupation, some of their allies were looking at exactly the same man and seeing a possible war criminal. Australia pushed to have Hirohito treated as a major war criminal. And you can see the logic. If Japan's wartime leaders were going on trial, why should the man on the throne automatically sit outside the process? So MacArthur was basically staring at two versions of the same Hirohito. One was the emperor who had sat above Japan throughout the war. Put that man on trial. The other was a symbol that could help orders move through the Japanese state without America rebuilding the whole country by hand. Keep that man. Same Hirohito. Completely different problem. MacArthur chose the second, and his argument was not sentimental. He believed arresting Hirohito could blow a hole in the government structure the occupation was already trying to use. If the emperor disappeared and the existing political order stopped cooperating, America might need more administrators, more troops, more money, and a much longer occupation. Basically, congratulations. You just made occupying the country you already defeated much harder. MacArthur took that possibility seriously enough to warn Washington that prosecuting Hirohito might eventually require at least 1 million occupation troops. That number needs a giant asterisk. It was MacArthur's estimate, not some later study proving that exactly 1 million soldiers would have been necessary. But it tells us how he saw Hirohito, not only as a man who might deserve punishment, but as a load-bearing part of the occupation plan. Remove him, MacArthur feared, and you might discover how much weight he had been carrying. So by early 1946, the man who looked like an obvious candidate for prosecution had acquired another job. Stabilizer. Problem solved. Not even close. Because keeping Hirohito created a completely different headache. America wasn't supposed to rebuild the same Japan it had just defeated. The occupation was also trying to transform Japan politically. Now those two goals started bumping into each other. America wanted the emperor's authority because it was useful. but it did not want the old emperor's political power. Okay, how do you keep one and get rid of the other? This is where the solution gets strange. Keep Hirohito. Change what Hirohito is. Japan's military was dismantled, its political institutions were reshaped, and under the new constitutional system, sovereignty no longer rested with the emperor. It rested with the people. Hirohito remained emperor, but now as a symbol of the state rather than a ruler with powers of government. Basically, keep the symbol, remove the sovereignty, the person stayed. The job changed underneath him. And suddenly the contradiction became manageable. The occupation could still use the symbolic weight of the emperor, while Japan moved through surrender, demobilization, and reconstruction. But the Japan coming out the other side would no longer place sovereign political power in his hands. So when people say America simply saved the emperor, that is true in one sense. Hirohito was not prosecuted, and the throne survived. But it can also give you the wrong picture. America did not preserve the old imperial system, dust it off, and put it back on the shelf. It kept one useful part while radically changing the system around it. There was still one uncomfortable question nobody could make disappear. What had Hirohito himself actually done during the war? Because if he had personally helped drive Japan into war, keeping him because he was administratively convenient starts looking a lot less comfortable. MacArthur told Washington that his investigation had not found the kind of concrete evidence he believed justified prosecuting Hirohito. His position was that the emperor had generally acted on the advice of the political and military figures around him. Convenient? Very. Case closed? No. Historians have spent decades arguing over how passive Hirohito really was. Some see a monarch heavily constrained by the military and political system around him. Others argue that he followed military affairs closely and played a more active role in major decisions than the post-war image suggested. And this is where it's easy to accidentally make the wrong video. We could spend the next hour arguing whether Hirohito was guilty, powerless, or somewhere in between. But that's a different question. Our question is why he was never put on trial. And for that, we don't need to pretend historians have reached some magical final verdict on everything he did. We only need to understand what the American-led occupation decided at the time. By early 1946, that decision was becoming pretty clear. Hirohito was more useful on the throne than in a courtroom. Putting him on trial threatened the government machinery America wanted to use, while keeping him appeared to make occupation and reform easier. And the Americans believed they could keep the emperor without keeping the old political power that came with being emperor. So the Tokyo trial moved ahead without him. Tojo and other senior leaders sat in the dock. 7 men were eventually sentenced to death. Hirohito stayed in the palace. And here's the part that's easy to miss. A court never examined a full prosecution case against Hirohito and declared him innocent. That didn't happen. Prosecutors never had to present the complete case, his defense never had to answer one, and judges never delivered a verdict. The political decision came first. The legal test never came. Once Hirohito stayed outside that courtroom, the occupation gained something else too. A cleaner break between the Japan that had fought the war and the Japan being built afterward. The wartime military leadership could be removed. The old constitutional order could be rewritten. Japan could become a new political system. And somehow, standing on both sides of that dividing line was the same emperor. Before the surrender, Hirohito had been emperor of an imperial state built around sovereign authority. After the occupation reforms, he remained emperor, but as a constitutional symbol. Same man, same throne, very different job. And that brings us back to the empty space in the Tokyo courtroom. At first, the mystery looks like this. Why didn't America punish Hirohito? But the more useful question is, why did America need him? Once you look at the occupation from that angle, the decision becomes much easier to understand. America had defeated Japan. Now it had to control Japan, disarm Japan, reform Japan, and somehow keep Japan functioning while doing all three. Hirohito was part of the system America wanted to change. But for a while, he was also one of the tools America thought it needed to change it. So the occupation made a very practical compromise. Keep the emperor, change the throne. And that is why the most obvious missing man at the Tokyo War Crimes trial never walked into the courtroom.